Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Dick Chait, professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dick studies the management and governance of colleges and universities, and he's known as one of the top experts in that field. His areas of study include roles, responsibilities, and performance of board of trustees, as well as faculty governance. He's taught at the school's Summer Institute program for executives in higher ed for over 20 years. He's been at a who's who of higher ed institutions, including the University of Maryland, Case Western Reserve, Penn State, and has also been a Fulbright Scholar to New Zealand. Dick, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you, Drumm.
Great to have you as well. You are one of the top governance people in the country, maybe even the world.
That's only because there are three of us.
And there's one other besides you and me, right?
Right, exactly.
And I think I'm working with him. That's Britt Kerwin.
Yep.
Who's a mutual friend of ours.
Absolutely.
But anyway, getting back to more sane things.
Okay.
We're here to talk about governance today, and it is one of my favorite subjects, and I know one of yours. You've been doing governance for a long time now.
Since the mid-1970s.
And I'd be willing to bet you've seen just a one or two changes.
Yes.
What do you see are the biggest changes that you've seen with the higher ed governance over that period of time?
Yeah, I think far and away, Drumm, the most dramatic change has been the degree to which the work has become much more serious. The days of an honorific ceremonial board that meets in a very perfunctory fashion and routinely rubber stamps every proposed action by the administration, those days are over. They've ended. If we wanted to look for a watermark, it'd probably be when the Enron scandal occurred and people came to recognize that governance was a pretty serious proposition. So today, by comparison, I think boards are more inquisitive, they're more active, they're likely to be more engaged than they were previously. And then two other developments that we can amplify later. In the public sector, governance has become more political, but that's true of nearly every institution in America, whether it's politics, religion, or higher education. The membrane that separates public colleges and universities from government has become ever thinner. And so there's more transfer, particularly from the political domain to higher education. And for private colleges, I think there's been a much greater emphasis on philanthropy, not simply on governance. Capacity in private institutions, capacity is a shorthand for the ability to make substantial donations. It is not a shorthand for intellectual capacity.
Yeah. Well, I think you've just given us our outline for the entire conversation today. There's a lot to unpack there. So, one of the things that I tell my clients is governance has changed over the years. And you referred to me the seminal thing, the Enron debacle, which gave us SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley.
Yep.
And then a few years down the line, the Great Recession gave us Dodd-Frank.
Yep.
And the corporate governance structure, and make no excuse, make no apology for it, governance is morphing from the corporate side over into higher ed. So we're starting to see much more proactive boards.
Right. And this gets to a still larger theme, Drumm. And I think it's quite ironic, but for trustees, most of whom are in for-profit arenas and many are in high level C-suites of publicly traded companies. If it happens in the corporate sector, it's good for higher education. And if it happens in higher education, it has no application to the corporate sector. I think that's incredibly mistaken. And I think data actually demonstrate that colleges and universities in the United States have long outlived the best corporations in America. If you take any of the seminal works, In Search of Excellence, Peters and Waterman, Good to Great, Re-engineering, many of those so-called great companies no longer exist. And the best colleges and universities are 200, 300 years old, but somehow the corporate sector seems to believe that what happens in higher education is peculiar and ultimately ineffective. And I think that's dead wrong. I would say, if you thought about it from balance of trade standpoint, we import a lot more than we export in American higher education. There are not too many American corporations that have that balance of trade.
No, you're absolutely right. It reminds me of a book that I read, back in the mid-90s, The Living Company by Gary DeHeis.
Mm-hmm.
And he said the book is out on corporations if it is going to be a viable mechanism, a viable structure.
I mean, I do think that a lot of value has been added. The idea of strategy migrated from the military to the corporation to higher education. For better or worse, the idea of consumerism, market segmentation, branding has traveled into higher education. But it's a strange virus. It only seems to travel from corporations to infect universities and not vice versa. I've rarely met a trustee who has asked, what's the secret that enables America's best colleges and universities to endure at a world-class level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a great thing. I think we could probably devote an entire podcast on that one thing. So, maybe in a month or so, we come back and hit that one.
All righty.
But, you raised an interesting point between the commonalities and the differences between public and private, and even corporate, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. It's a very pronounced difference. It starts most obviously with the appointment mechanism. Private college boards, with few exceptions, are self-perpetuated organizations. Sometimes alumni associations or religious orders might have the opportunity to make some appointments, but the bulk of the board is self-selected. Whereas at public institutions, almost no one is self-selected. The variety goes from elected officials, elected trustees in places like Michigan and Nebraska, to mostly gubernatorial appointments. So first, you have little or no control over who becomes a member of a public board. And it's hard to build a team, right, if you can't control the draft choices. It's just
seeing that football kicked off just yesterday.
Yes, exactly. So that's one major difference. A second difference, which is probably more profound and more significant, is whatever the ideological, personal, and political views of private college trustees, the overwhelming majority are there to place the institution's interest first and at the heart of decisions. That's not true of public institutions.
No.
There are many trustees, and I don't say this disapprovingly, there are many trustees who will argue that the taxpayer, I'm there to represent the taxpayer. I'm there to represent the governor. After all, I was a gubernatorial appointment. I'm there to represent a particular region of the state, a particular demography of the state, a particular industry of the state. There are institutions that, like Penn State, where people are appointed from particular communities, that is, industrial communities, agricultural communities. So there's no assurance that their transcendent interest is the well-being of the institution. They may have other interests at stake. So that's a second important difference. Third, public universities are almost invariably smaller. So every person counts for more. Every mistake in terms of an appointment, every regrettable appointment becomes even more important, more exaggerated when you're one of 9 or one of 12 than when you're one of 30. And then I guess the last difference I would cite is most public universities have an obligation to meet in public. Private institutions have no obligation to meet in public. And if you were going to map strategy or try to achieve competitive advantage or explore in a very tentative way some fairly radical, drastic, unpopular ideas, would you rather do that publicly or privately? If you have some internal disputes, would you like to settle your marital disputes on television with the cameras rolling or privately with a counselor?
I think that really depends on your political party, doesn't it? No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. No, and what I've typically have found is public boards who are big oversight with the sunshine laws make good use and sometimes abusive use of executive session.
Of executive sessions and back channel communication.
Yes.
So they talk to each other offline, one or two at a time, and you have the classic sort of game of telephone in which information is repeated, and as it's repeated, it's warped.
Yeah. One of the challenges that I see with this, and you're absolutely spot on with the allegiance aspect. You know, the publics are frequently, their allegiance is not to the institution, but to the body, the person who appointed them to that board, or to the public if they represent a, quote, region of the state. That is in opposition to law, is it not? The fiduciary duties of being your responsibility is the duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience to the institution.
Yeah, I think in the extreme that would probably be the case at Drumm, but I think you can make a plausible argument. The administration would like to increase tuition. I think it's in the interest of the citizens of the state not to increase tuition, and therefore we will get a broader socioeconomic swath of students, and that's ultimately better for the university. Or I think it's better that we admit more in-state students than out-of-state students. The university is on a quest for glory. We're on a quest for an educated workforce within the state. So it's not as if the arguments are some of the arguments are without merit, but you're absolutely right. I can summon pretty easily some blatant examples that I think do violate fiduciary responsibility, and some of them are afoot today. For example, about appointment of presidents at the behest of a elected official, or changes in curriculum that conform to a particular ideology.
Yeah, we probably ought not to go into any of those in detail, but we all know where we're talking about and what we're talking about. One of the challenges that I'm seeing is that very thing about curriculum, about appointments of presidents, specifically curriculum, and in the state of Florida for that matter. That is a real challenge, and it's turned into almost a tit for tat example between the state of Florida, the Stop Woke Act, the requiring of the Florida schools to find a new accreditor every 5 years. Where do the boards sit on all these, or do the boards even have a say?
I am not inside those boardrooms, and I think it's no surprise that boardrooms that are heavily politicized are the least likely to want the advice of a student of governance. So I'm not in I'm not in those boardrooms, and since I have a a very skewed sample because I work with boards that aspire to be still better. But I think, Drumm, it returns one of the earlier propositions we just discussed. If the governor appoints you, the governor may control you. Or to put it a different way, the governor may appoint people he or she can control.
Yes. And we see that all too frequently in many states. It's not just Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that you and I chatted about before was the self-perpetuating of the board for privates.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, publics, I know publics who have had board members on there for 40 plus years.
Yep.
How do you get a change like that to happen? I know we use a skills matrix. We suggest term limits in the bylaws, et cetera. But for a public institution, that's not going to happen in most cases.
Yeah, it's actually, I think, less of a challenge for public sector institutions. Most of them do have term limits. I think where you see the most longevity is in states where trustees are publicly elected. And so their incumbents have a certain advantage of name recognition, and they're elected over and over again. Although I think even that may start to change. In the private sector, there are a couple of factors that are very difficult to overcome. Number one is this collapse or confluence of philanthropy and governance. So it's very difficult to run the risk that you offend a donor by saying your term is up, or that you risk disengagement with that donor. We loved you dearly, continue to write the checks, but you're no longer allowed into the boardroom. So that's one reason. A second is, in a sort of perverse fashion, a lot of these trustees are irrevocably in love with the institution. They don't want to leave. It's a lifelong love affair, starting with their first day as a first-year student, and that affection is abiding. So they're slow to leave, and they convince themselves and the nominating committee that there's no one like them to replace them. But it's a very, very dangerous proposition. I think trustees are quick to forget that they're in essentially, not exclusively, but they're essentially in a youth-oriented business. And the likelihood, with all due respect, that people my age or your age understand 18 to 22-year-olds, even people that have, even companies that spend billions of dollars on market analysis, whether it's the Gap or Urban Outfitters, Abercrombie and Fitch, they get it wrong. And they've got a lot of merchandise they need to discount. So what happens when you get boards that are superannuated is not only are they out of touch with today's customer, but because they're alumni, they have a time warped notion of what the college should be. And it's as if they want to recreate the campus in sepia.
Yeah, it always scares me when I'm called for an engagement with a board, and I take a look at the list of the board members, and they all have this parentheses at the end of their name with the year, and it's like, oh my gosh, they have 99 out of 100 board members. I'm exaggerating a little bit. Usually it's somewhere around 40 to 50 board members, and 80 to 85% of them are all alums.
Yeah. I mean, there's a supreme irony here, which is if you ask trustees, if we could make one unilateral autocratic change to higher education, I think the vast majority would say I would eliminate tenure, but they would not eliminate tenure on the board.
Yes. Was it do as I say, not as I do kind of thing?
Yeah.
No, that is a challenge. You talked about an increased tension between governance and philanthropy. And that is, it's interesting because I've seen that not only in private institutions, but I've seen that in publics too.
Oh, absolutely.
But the donation doesn't necessarily go to the university. It goes to the politician's election fund or reelection fund.
Yep. Or it goes to some booster organization or some foundation that is apart from the university's governance structure, or it goes to a hospital. Yes, this conflation of governance and philanthropy, I think, is one of the most fraught developments of the 4 decades or so that I've been in this territory. First of all, large donors have large says. Should that be the case is debatable, but there is and I'm using a hypothetical here so the audience will understand it, but it's strictly hypothetical. There's a big difference. If Warren Buffett and I are on the same board, a college board, if Warren says something, it carries a little different weight than if I say it. And so the first thing is that you have sort of an dramatically unequal voices. And second, that philanthropic heft carries beyond any one area. Let's say you have a donor who's keenly interested in the arts or in STEM field. Their views on a student center or a student union will still carry a lot of weight because there's this implicit concern that the philanthropy will be withdrawn. It also affects how presidents interact with trustees. My voice is a whisper. Warren Buffett could speak at the same decibel level I do, and it's a shout because it has an enormous fortune behind those whispers. So the boards are often constituted to maximize philanthropic contributions. That cuts against having younger trustees who haven't accumulated wealth, having a diverse board where people may have not had equal opportunity to accumulate wealth, to having people whose interests run toward less affluent areas like the arts and humanities. So I think it's a development that's really unfortunate because it seems to me that financial capacity trumps intellectual capacity. And it's not that people with financial capacity have less intellect, but if you have the money, it's less important whether you would be a good team player on the board.
Yeah, which is a great point to bring up because on the board, you have a typical makeup of people. And this kind of leads us into the most effective boards. So what are the most effective boards you've seen? And then what are some of the prototypical people that you see on a board that make them effective or make them not effective?
All right. Well, no names, but there are I think some hallmark characteristics of effective boards. They're not many. First, they have a extraordinary ability to focus on a few issues of transcendent importance and to sustain that focus over time. I've seen effective boards that will take a handful of issues and say for the next 3 to 4 years, these issues are going to dominate our agenda. I've often referred to these as whales in the pool, because if we don't identify the whales in the pool and focus on those, then the paramecia and the amoeba are mistaken for humpbacks and people head off in the wrong direction. So number one is the ability to focus. And second, to focus in meaningful, consequential ways, to be engaged not as an audience for a PowerPoint presentation, but as thought partners in a think tank with the president. And they perform indispensable, not fungible functions. So one question that I've always enjoyed placing before a board is a hypothetical. And the hypothetical goes along these lines. If the board of this college were to cease all operations for the next 3 years, in effect, the board were to hibernate, what would be the gravest consequence to this college? And the answer to that question is what a board should do. Because if things will continue to function and somehow paths will be lighted and signage will be erected, that's not adding a great deal of value as a board. And I guess there are two other things I would mention. Strong boards have a very positive and explicit culture and norms. It's much like a family, that you've joined a family or you've joined a team. And I say this often to boards that have Division I athletic teams or even Division III. You don't join a team and say, I'll come to practice when I want to, I'll eat what I choose to, I don't particularly like this playbook, I'll use a different one. You think we're here to play basketball, I actually think we're here to play hockey. You know, if you join a team, there's certain norms that are in place, and they're often very explicit, that guide people's behavior, guide their conduct, guide their values. And the last point I would mention is the very best boards epitomize or personify the very attributes they want the institution to exhibit or manifest. So if we want performance accountability across the campus, we have to have performance accountability in the boardroom. If we want diversity and heterogeneity, it has to be in the boardroom. If we want to harness technology, if we want to have civil conversations and debate, if we want to have a broad swath of political and ideological points of view, all of those need to be modeled in the boardroom. Otherwise, it's sheer hypocrisy. And that comes back to the issue of essentially lifelong appointments of trustees without performance accountability.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point, because when you talk about accountability in the boardroom, you're not only talking about holding the administration accountable, but the board holding themselves accountable for their own performance.
Absolutely. And so the best boards are self-reflective, they're self-policing, self-monitoring. They are very attentive to how they do business. They are exemplars of what is often called reflective practice. So there's more self-assessment, self-evaluation by the board. They ask themselves regularly, what can we do to be a better partner to the president? How can we add more value? How can we be a strategic asset? Again, another one of these ironies is that trustees, Drumm, and you've surely experienced this, they want the administration to outsmart the competition, outmaneuver the competition, sometimes outspend the competition, outwork the competition. I've never heard a board say, let's outgovern the competition.
Oh my gosh, I knew I was going to have fun with this conversation, Dick. You're absolutely right. And effective boards have that culture. They have that culture of holding themselves accountable, of being a partner to the president. It's not only holding the president and his or her administration accountable, but it's there on the other role of being a consultant to the president, to partner to make sure the institution is everything and more that it could be.
Yep. And that segues into the question you asked a moment ago about individual trustees and the characteristics of those people. It's so entirely obvious. They listen more as effectively as they speak. In fact, they listen more effectively. They are much more likely to lead with questions than answers. They're much more apt to help discover problems than prescribe solutions. They are likely to ask themselves, what if I'm wrong? Not what if you're wrong? And they are what I like to think of as they are good tourists. They recognize that they're in a foreign culture when they come back to the campus, that the average university, in terms of its governance and its operations, bears little resemblance to Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, or Boeing. But they don't ask themselves, or they don't conduct themselves as if they were still in the mother country. You don't go to anywhere from an Arab nation to Italy or France or Africa and say, darn it, here's how we do it back home. And I don't really give a damn that you drive on the left-hand side. I'm driving on the right-hand side, and we'll see how it goes. I think the really good trustees say, well, this is interesting. You drive on the other side of the road, not the wrong side of the road.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of walking in London.
Yes.
There's a signpost there that says, look right.
Yeah, that's it.
And you're crossing the street, look right. It's like, trustees, you need to look right or left, having nothing to do with political agendas, but to look there. One of the smartest things I ever saw a board do, and I was there for their first time doing it, was they went to the cafeteria and they ate lunch with the students.
Uh-huh.
Oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. And then we did a 45-minute sharing what you learned about the institution.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was probably the most valuable 45 minutes that board had ever spent in the last 3 years of being on the board.
And if we go back to the example of the pedestrian in London, what trustees need to remember is your instincts are wrong. If you follow your instincts in London, you're going to be dead.
Yes.
As a pedestrian. So you have to learn as a trustee that just because this makes absolutely no sense to you, that a professor has as much autonomy or authority as seems to be the case, or that students can more or less, chant and protest whatever they please. If you say that's no way to run a railroad, you're right. But the point is, it's not a railroad.
Exactly. I've seen so many stories like this when I'm doing board presentations, and you get to the, are we micromanaging, or are we, doing that type of thing? One of my favorite cartoons is the manager is up sitting on top of the door with a magnifying glass and the workers are down below. One turns to the other and says, I hate it when he micromanages us. The boards can't do that.
Yeah.
And some of the boards, especially the public boards that I've worked with, they're appointed by the legislature, by the governor, whatever. They've never run a $2 billion business before.
Right.
And that's what we're asking board members to do, is oversee a $2 billion, $1 billion business. Right. It's very different than the local bank or your law firm or whatever.
And if you look at the largest public universities now, the number would be between 6 and 8 billion.
Yes.
If they have health systems.
Mm-hmm. So, Dick, I've enjoyed this conversation. I knew we were going to get to the end of it very quickly. 3 takeaways for board chairs and presidents, about what they need to do with governance. Okay, well, make it more than 3.
No. Let's go with 3. It's really a summation of our conversation. Be cognizant of the world that you inhabit as a trustee. It is a different world. It's a world that may seem to you to be upside down, sort of Alice in Wonderland. But remember that it's endured and it's actually thrived. So my plea would be, if you have an instinct to be just a little disdainful and dismissive of academic norms and the academic business model, try to be just a little bit more respectful and deferential. The second is a kind of a converse of the first. That doesn't mean that you roll over and play dead. It means that you bring your talents to bear in a different environment. And that's what should be the intellectual challenge of being a trustee, is you do have skills and expertise that could benefit the university, but it has to be applied in a way that is organizationally congruent. And third, I guess I would plead with trustees to recognize what is increasingly obvious, and that is that the college and university presidency is somewhere between joyless and miserable. It is just it is a hell of a job. I would kind of liken it to being the mayor of a large metropolitan city, except we have ideological precincts, we have departmental precincts, we have identity precincts, whether it's Boston or Chicago. The question is whose streets are plowed first. It's the same in the academy. It's so hard to satisfy alumni, donors, current students, faculty, legislators, the press. So my plea to trustees is recognize, I once said to a board at the time, I regretted it, Drumm, and actually I no longer do. Some trustees have an attitude that if you run a business, you can run a university. And if you run a university, you can't run anything. No one would be on a board would be terribly surprised if someone had a successful career at Merck and then became president of a large public university. But if you and I said, we empirically know that person X is the single best university president in the history of the academy, no one would say, gee, Merck ought to consider that individual for the next CEO's opening. And so I think you have to be really mindful of how difficult this job is. It may look to you as a trustee as if you preside at a lot of functions and go to a lot of athletic events. It's an incredibly difficult job where the ratio between frustration and fulfillment is getting worse all the time.
I tell boards that the university president is the second most difficult CEO position in the world, the first behind that of a hospital who's dealing with life and death.
Yep. Amen.
Yeah. So, Dick, this has been great. What's next for you?
I'm retired, Drumm. I don't have my next is self-indulgence.
Well, I can highly recommend Hawaii.
Okay, I'll take that under advisement. Great to talk with you.
You too, sir. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Dr. Dick Chait and for his sharing his insights on the changing nature of higher ed governance. Our next guest is Dr. Ami Moyal, president of Avecca College of Engineering in Tel Aviv, Israel. Avecca is a great case study for higher education transformation and growth. For example, since Ami took over, Avecca has grown 42%, and 97% of its graduates are employed in the engineering industry, with over 50% of those in R&D. It is a great case study, and you won't want to miss this one. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.